Hey, and welcome to another episode of Talk on Things as Stuff. Hold on, I had a little audio issue there. No echo now, I can speak more clearly. So today we're going to do just a quick episode covering something that I put together as kind of a humorous take on an issue that frequently came up as I was originally navigating my own space, kind of dealing with issues in my upbringing in Mormonism, and something that comes up frequently, especially with young men looking back and reevaluating some of the trauma that happened in their life psychologically. So in trying to explain to people how I re-envision this particular issue, I drew upon the rich culture of poetry, specifically Shel Silverstein's poetry, and a poem called The Sharp-Toothed Snail, and wrote an article that you can find on the Thoughts on Things and Stuff blog. And so this episode is basically going to be a read-through of that article, and then we'll take some calls and see what anyone has to say about it. So I am going to go ahead and bring that up on the screen, and it's going to be kind of just, a dramatic reading of an article. Okay, so here we go. Let's bring it up. I'm going to start out The Illustrious Burden of the Sharp-Toothed Snail. There is already a kind of a spoken word version of it on the YouTube channel that you can find, and we'll start now. I have to confess that as a young man, there is a book that I loved reading way more than the scriptures. I was first introduced to it in Mrs. Roberts' 5th grade gifted and talented class. Its author was more revered to me than any other. Shel Silverstein. The book was Where the Sidewalk Ends. Now, this little tome of silly poems and illustrations could be read over and over again, and new insights and humor would always be forthcoming. There was one illustration and poem that I've often repeated to my kids when I find them in the throes of its topic, nose picking. Warning. Inside everybody's nose, there lives a sharp-toothed snail. If you stick your finger in, he may bite off your nail. Stick it farther up inside, he may bite your ring off. Stick it all the way, and he may bite the whole darn thing off. Warning by Shel Silverstein. Now, as adults, we know that this tale is used to instill fear in children to avoid this unpleasant habit. And we know the tale is just a fiction, and I always use the poem as a fun distraction and not a dire threat. I wonder, though, what the world would be like if people actually believed this tale and taught it with strict enforcement to children. Let's zoom this up a little bit so it's a little bit easier to read. All right, that's a little bit easier to read. Silversteinianism. Suppose that Shel Silverstein was revered as a prophet of God. His books of poetry, scripture, and his illustrations, absolute truth. Silversteinian parents used his poems to teach lessons about what was right and wrong and what the realities of the world were. The lessons from the poems in his books were considered doctrine, early training. Because it was addressed directly, the vile and unclean practice of nose-picking was particularly condemned. From a very early age, parents would instill a fear of nose-picking in their children. It wasn't directly referred to while the children were infants. The parents themselves would make sure to set an example by using many layers of Kleenex to protect their fingers when they wiped the infant's nose. As the infant grew, the parents were very careful to guard the wandering finger against making its way into the nostril, yanking the hand away from the face and emphatically shouting, "No!" This started to instill a fear of his nose in the mind of a young child. As the child grew and could now understand language, the parents would recite the poem Warning frequently, and his baseline fear of his nose was further elaborated and personified by the sharp-toothed snail that lived within it. How did the snail get in there? Why would God create humans with such dangerous creatures lurking about their nasopharyngeal passages? These questions would occasionally cross the youth's mind, but were only fleeting and paled in comparison with the tangible horror that adults expressed any time his finger even brushed his nose. Sacred science. Furthermore, since the nose was blessed with so strict a guardian as a sharp-toothed snail, it was assumed that this olfactory appendage was the most sacred and protected part of the human body. It was, after all, the defining feature of the face and was squarely present in the middle of every human encounter. It only seemed natural to the Silversteinians that it should be regarded as such. As a result, the prohibitions against nose-picking took on both an aura of fear as well as a sort of worship of the sacred. In either case, it was not something that could be ignored, and began to occupy more and more of the child's fascination, a fascination that was only reinforced every time he was reproved for threatening its desecration. A new sensation. As the child grew, there were practical problems. His nose generated things which impaired his ability to breathe. Boogers. These crusty and sticky things would start to fill up his nasal passages, and he was helpless to do anything about it. Sometimes at night he would find that his hand unconsciously found its way to his face, and he would find himself waking up to find his finger digging through his nose, clearing out all the nasty buildup of boogies and snot. He would frantically stop himself from violating these strict and sacred boundaries. Checking his finger to make sure that it was still whole, he would at the same time feel intense shame and guilt. He couldn't notice that he could breathe easier, though. This too fed into his guilt. He had been told that other people who did not understand the sacred nature of the nasal passages would excavate them regularly with abandon. If God had intended the nose to be violated by a finger, he would not have created it to manufacture boogers or populated it with the dangerous sharp-toothed snail. How could these people not see this? They shamelessly violated the sacred trust of the nose, all for the selfish gratification of uninhibited, closed-mouth inhalation. Disgusting. Even if the sharp-toothed snail didn't manage to remove the offending digit in return, they would surely find a painful torment as a reward in the life after this. The hapless child who found himself trapped in a cycle of nocturnal nose-digging could only think of himself as falling to the same degenerate levels as the vilest hedonist. He felt worthless, now that it was no longer an accidental happenstance that found him to wake with a finger knuckle-deep into his nose. He would consciously pick under cover of darkness. Nobody will see. The cycle of guilt. The relief of a full, uninhibited respiration was unlike anything he could remember, and he would dig frantically after he was sure that his family was safe and soundly asleep. The thrill and anticipation of that first deep breath would build as he dug deeper and deeper, first the tip of his finger, often the most gratifying as the low-lying fruit was usually the most desiccated and lent itself to the tactile rolling of the booger between the first and second digits. It would be a game to see how many would stick to the opposite wall after a good flick. Returning to the task at hand, the second, and then the first knuckle plunged the depths of his choanal canal. It's a word for nasal passages. Look it up. He had learned a while ago that either his sharp-toothed snail was hiding much deeper in his nose than he ever ventured, or that his snail was waiting to catch him off guard. He didn't care at this point. The enticement of that first full inspiration of air through his nose blinded him to these fearful realities. Once he had evicted every reachable boogie, nose goblin, and snotwad from his schnoz under cover at night, he would indulge in the most divine experience he could ever remember. A full, unimpeded intake of air through clean, uninhibited nostrils. This was no simple inhalation. Having been accustomed to mouth breathing due to chronically occluded nasal passages, he saw the difference. Air taking in through the nose was warmed and moisturized through the nasal turbinates. It was filtered of particulate matter by the numerous nasal hairs. A full breath of nose-breathed air was not like the cold, impersonal, and sterile air that the mouth provided. It was a tailor-made experience created by his own body to fulfill the essence of existence. Surely the breath of life which God had granted humanity was taken through the nose. But just as soon as he had taken this first ecstatic breath and held it for a few short moments to savor its transcendent transcendental powers, his previous fears and guilt would come flooding to his mind. The spell of the anticipated breath was broken, and he would exhale quickly and fully through his mouth. How could he have fallen to such base and selfish impulses? Disgusted with himself, he would violently wash his hands of all the evidence of his crime. In the morning, he'd have to hide the evidence of his nocturnal excursions, cleaning the snot stains and booger debris from his bed sheets, castigating himself this whole time in his mind. Idiot! Doofus! You know you weren't supposed to do that. Do you want to lose your finger? What would Silverstein think if he knew you ignored his warning? You deserve anything bad that happens today. The dangers of the unbridled nose. The youth goes through his day seeing his parents, friends, and Silversteinian leaders all completely confident in their ability to abstain from the foul deed. This thought only leads him to condemn himself more. In his group meetings, he listens to the Silversteinians assigned to instruct the youths in the ways of the world. They regularly teach about the importance of abstaining from anything that even alludes to a whiff of digital nasal excavation, and speak as though only the weakest and lowest of people engage in such forms of nasal self-abuse. He's instructed on how, once cleared of the protective shell of boogery crust, the underlying olfactory senses become accustomed to the enticing and savory, uninhibited scents that the unencrusted world has to offer. He's warned how the sensuous appetites of the perpetrator become aroused, and they start fixating their lives on experiencing more intense and exotic smells. It may start with a particularly pungent European cheese or the unmuted fragrance of a bouquet of flowers, but soon enough the unbridled reprobate moves on to more bizarre and gratifying perversions. The gunk extracted from beneath one's toenails, the aroma of a dead skunk on the road, dog farts. The offender's foul appetites will drive him to these indecent and unnatural extremes. The guilt-ridden child cannot hold his head up in classes. He's racked with guilt. He realizes that he has been secretly sniffing his own armpits. It has begun. He himself is on this lonely and dreary path to utter depravity, the filthy nose plunderer, hopelessness. As the child tries again and again to abstain from this filthy habit, he's confronted with his undeniable weakness. He tried bargaining with God, promising that if he read all of Shel Silverstein's book 3 times over and memorized his most important poems, then God would grant him the strength to stop picking. That failed. No amount of reading or memorizing would remove his desire to breathe freely or experience the full spectrum of nasal sensation. On the advice of a high-ranking Silversteinian leader, he attempted to tie his arms to the bedpost to prevent subconscious exploration of his nasal passages that his hands seemed to fall into. This, too, failed, as the very hands which tied the bindings were adept in removing them when sufficiently motivated. Despite these and other strategies, he continued to fall into this pit. He began to hate his nose. Worse still, he hated himself. Everyone else also has a nose, but they all manage to keep their fingers out of it. The problem is clearly with himself. He's the one who is at fault because he is the one who can't master his own body. Even with all the help that the Silversteinians offered and all the effort he could muster, it wasn't enough. His imagination was filled with the remembrances of the sense he had experienced. It elated and disgusted him at the same time. He wondered if he wouldn't be a better person if only his hands were cut off and replaced with hooks, just like Captain Hook in Silverstein's sacred poem, which you can read as follows.
Captain Hook must remember not to scratch his toes. Captain Hook must watch out and never pick his nose. Captain Hook must be gentle when he shakes your hand. Captain Hook must be careful opening sardine cans and playing tag and pouring tea and turning pages of his book. Lots of folks I'm glad I ain't, but mostly Captain Hook.
So the child continues to grow. He suffers constant and repeated feelings of inadequacy, all the while amazed at the ability of those around him to abstain from his curse so effortlessly. His non-Silversteinian friends regularly joke about nose-picking, but he knows that they are not enlightened enough to know the severity of the sacred forces that they are toying with. One joke in particular irks him. "What do you find inside a clean nose?" a friend would ask. "Fingerprints," was the reply, followed by fits of loud laughter. Couldn't they see how damaging it was to deal so lightly with something so sacred? He would caution himself from becoming too attached to these so-called friends. They didn't hold his standards. Even if he wasn't able to keep the standards, he should at least surround himself with the sort of righteous, upstanding Silversteinians who could. Then perhaps they would lift him up to their level rather than drag him down. Alone. Years pass, and the child grows into a young man. One day he walks into his father's office and sees what he thinks is a glimpse of his father retracting a finger from his left nostril. In a stifled and abrupt motion, his father rubs his nose and makes an abrupt comment about how there was an itch on his left outer nose, accenting the word outer a bit more forcefully than seemed necessary. After leaving the office, the youth wonders if it was possible that his own father was guilty of the same weakness that had plagued him. While at first it gives him hope that his father may have compassion and understanding for him, he remembers the passion and intensity that his father displayed during his last rant against those vile nose plunderers. He couldn't risk asking his father and revealing himself to be the biggest nose plunderer of all. His own father would look at him with disgust all the rest of his life. Escape and knowledge. Now imagine that the youth grows in experience in life and eventually discovers that Shel Silverstein was not actually a prophet of God, but was actually some crazy kook who was very creative, but took himself and his poems way too seriously. One of the implications is that the laws and restrictions that only made sense if Silversteinianism was true needed to be reevaluated. The only reason that nose-picking was condemned so harshly and completely is because of a story about an imaginary snail. Sure, people could become obsessed about their nasal passages and end up hurting themselves by being too aggressive and fixated, but the odd thing is that such a fixation was almost unheard of outside of groups that called great attention to the practice by condemning it so completely. Furthermore, it turns out that almost everybody picks their nose. It's completely socially unacceptable to be done in public for sure, but most people simply reserve their nasal excavations for private times, when they're not likely to gross people out. Among non-Silversteinians, the parents do not teach their children that they are evil or weak for experiencing what is by all accounts a normal part of human existence. Study after study shows that nose-picking is almost universal, and furthermore doesn't stop when people grow into adults and move into more complex living situations. This was particularly interesting because as a youth, the child had heard of marriages that were broken up after one of the spouses was discovered to be a filthy nose-picker and disfellowshipped from the group. If the studies are true, then the very Silversteinian leaders who enacted this condemnation were likely guilty of nose plundery themselves. What hypocrites! The most remarkable thing happened once he let go of the fears that had kept him in turmoil. He began to smell the beauty of the world around him. The fresh, subtle fragrance of the morning after a rainfall, the complex aroma of an aged cheese, the intoxicating smell of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies. These sensations filled him with a love of the world around him. People who had grown up without the threat of the sharp-toothed snail had been able to experience these things without anxiety or guilt because there was nothing to fear. They could clear their nose without a second thought. They breathed freely, and the amount of time they spent racked with guilt and self-doubt over doing so was non-existent. Once leaving the Silversteinians, the young man was tempted to talk about his experience with members who were still beating themselves up over this problem. He knew, however, that to bring up nose plunder in any degree of permissiveness or frankness would immediately invite accusations. He could hear them already in his mind because he would have made the same accusations. Well, that's why you left the Silversteinians. You were a filthy nose picker who couldn't bridle your booger harvesting ways. Didn't we warn you that violating those sacred nasal passages would lead you into the pit of hell? Get thee behind me, apostate. All of these arguments would have seemed to make sense to him until he discovered just how much of a crazy cook Silverstein was, and how all the things that he claimed were true were in fact the vain imaginations of his addled mind. Regret and hope. The young man felt particularly bad for the friends and colleagues that he had judged so harshly for not having his standards. They had been patient with him and had made accommodations for his standards in nose-picking and other prohibitions, but he had only ever looked at them with a sort of condescending pity. Gathering all the confidence he could muster, despite his regrets, the young man swore never to give any of his children the same curse of guilt and self-abasement by filling their heads with the lies and condemnations of a crazy lunatic, no matter how entertaining his poetry is. Else, also, no one ever lost a finger to the sharp-toothed snail, ever. The end. This was originally published in January of 2014. I added some images in May 2015, and that is that. So, if you want to talk about this, because I think you might know what this little message is about, and maybe it affected you in your own life, well, you can call now. The number to call is 210-422-2222, and tell us if you had any similar experiences to the one that is there, or if you just want to talk about anything else that is on your mind. So again, the number is 210-422-2222. In the meantime, we can look at some comments. Let's go back to this. Okay. Ariel Music says that she read these books growing up too. I mean, I think it's pretty ubiquitous. Silverstein's poetry is great. I mean, if they're just fantastic poems to sit down and read to your kids. Let's see here. The question is, again, is this being used as an analogy for masturbation and sexual purity? Well, I don't know. I mean, did you guys have that type of interaction in terms of the judgment, the self-recrimination, the guilt, the shame, the sense of worthlessness? Those are the type of things that we deal with. Okay, we got our first call. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. What's on your mind?
I was just kind of thinking, kind of getting the tones of sexual purity / nose picking, and just thinking of a dear friend. She had some sexual abuse as a child, and just kind of thinking about kind of purity culture, I guess, in terms of the nose picking, kind of that idea of feeling like a filthy nose picker when you weren't even the one that picked your nose. It was kind of forced upon you, and kind of the damage that can do.
Yeah. I think this essay does not even address that aspect of how assigning guilt and shame and worthlessness to a bodily function can be so damaging in the mode of purity culture in that way, where people are given the sense that there's this virtue or innocence or virginity that they have that can be taken or violated by somebody else, and that they somehow are damaged in that process. And that it is so sacred that to do this somehow impairs your spiritual nature or your status. And so, this is more just about people dealing with own internalized guilt. But when you add, as you very empathetically and significantly point out, when you add people who are victimized by child abuse in the most in a way that can affect people so deeply and personally, because these things always happen in an aura of secrecy, where the children then are compelled to be secret about that, not only because of the guilt and shame that has now already been tied to issues of sexual purity, that young children aren't able to, in a sophisticated way, distinguish things for which they have no guilt from things that they would put in the category of something they have guilt. So when something happens like abuse, then they feel like they personally are broken or unworthy or like a chewed piece of gum. And so as intense as these feelings of worthlessness are in this essay, just imagine that so much more heavy and intense when it's in the arena of abuse. And, that's one of the things that, because I did not experience anything like that in my own personal growth, I don't have any firsthand knowledge of it. But in my advocacy work with the Protect LDS Children movement headed by Sam Young, where he invited people to share their experiences, and you got to see how deep those wounds were and how long lasting the effects of them were, then we're dealing with some very serious trauma that has happened in people's lives that they're still healing from decades later.
Exactly. And again, for my friend, it has been decades later. And I think to add insult to injury, it was she had tried to bring it to the attention of the adults around her, and they didn't necessarily believe her or think it was as serious. And just thanks for the show and your thoughts. It's awesome to listen to.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in and sharing a little bit of your perspective. We'll talk again soon. Take care. Okay. If you have just started looking beyond the straight narrative of the church in the past couple of years, maybe since coronavirus has hit, then you may not be familiar with the Protect LDS Children movement. If you Google that, you'll find their website. One of the most valuable resources on that website is a database of anonymous stories of people who themselves were affected by abuse in the context of the church. And in some cases, this was abuse that was perpetrated directly by priesthood leadership. And in other cases, it was abuse that was either covered up or not believed by church leadership. So definitely check that out. You are on Talk on Things and Stuff. What's on your mind?
Hello. I got through it well. Hang on, I better turn the volume down. I was just
What's on your mind?
My name's Nicola. I got through it well. I think it can be. I better turn the volume down. I was just.
What's on your mind?
Okay, sorry, I'm turning it up instead of it down.
If you mute it and just talk on the phone, that's
sorry.
fine.
I think it can be. Tell me, for some reason the volume's not coming. My volume's not going down. Sorry, I'm turning it up instead of it.
Okay, hold on.
Sorry. Okay. Tell me, for some reason the volume's not coming. My volume's not going down. Sorry, I'm turning it up instead of it.
Okay, it's possible that it's a problem on my end. Try hanging up and calling back.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Oh, there you are.
Sorry. I think I've done it now. I'm sorry for all of that. I think it can be dangerous either way. I grew up in England, so lots of my friends, I can't hear you now, so do I have to turn the TV on to hear you?
Are you able to hear me at all?
Oh, now I can hear you.
No worries.
I grew up in England, and I think it can be dangerous both ways, because I had friends that weren't members of the church and ended up sleeping with people, and it really, really damaged them, and they're still damaged from relationships that they had, and they didn't have all the stuff from the church. Like, they didn't have all the restrictions that I had. But they went and they got in these relationships, and the relationships were really, really quite dangerous to them. So I think that it's not good for people to be putting all that. Basically, they shouldn't be putting all of that stress on you. But at the same time, like, they were damaged because of these relationships that they got into, because they didn't have any of the guidelines that I had. So I don't know. I think that it's very dangerous, especially if like you've had some abuse. Because I had some things that happened to me, because the problem was the church is really, like, when I grew up, my parents didn't put me into any of the sexual classes, and everybody knew in the class that I hadn't gone into there. So there they started making fun of me and everything. And it was so I think the church is really, because not knowing information is as bad as it's not good to not know information. And so it's the whole thing is just, it can be really, really messed up. It's good to have some sort of guidelines, but it's they make way too, there was one of the girls in my seminary class and they were calling her slag because she got pregnant, and it wasn't really, really, that was really terrible. In fact, I told the bishop I wasn't going back to church until he sorted it out, since it's his children that were doing it. And they did sort it out. I just took myself off to a different ward. But you can do a lot more, you can get away with a lot more stuff than you do in England than you can here in Utah. I think it's because in England, I had my other friends, and I don't think that I never felt like I didn't hold them to the same standards as I had, but I think they were really good. And they were very patient with me, like they said in the poem. But I didn't think down on them. I just think that I just felt like I had a higher standard that I had to live up to.
Yeah.
Than
No, you bring up some
Sorry.
excellent points here, and I think that one of the things that you do see happen when people leave the safety blanket of the church and its standards, there's several different directions that they can go in. And I think you'll probably observe that many people are like, well, now that I'm out of the church, anything that the church taught as a moral value has no basis in anything, and I don't have to follow it up. I can do whatever I want. And while you can do whatever you want, a lot of the boundaries that we as a society have set in various different contexts, including religious, are done for practical reasons, and they do carry beneficial results. And so things even as fundamental as just marriage, but also standards and having some boundaries for, when you get pregnant and understanding things like all of those things have implications and consequences. And so the way that I approach it is not, when you leave the church, suddenly there's no right and wrong. All morals are relative, and you don't have that. It's much more examining some of the things that you've pointed out here, where you can see that when you look at the consequences of something like teenage pregnancy and preventing people from actually getting real education about sexual subject matter, then you get bad outcomes. When you look at the opportunities that are missed for a mother who happens to be a teenage mother because they get pregnant when they're a teenager, there are consequences are that. And so as a parent raising teenagers, you can still have boundaries and teach values that are informed by very understandable consequences. And the way that I look at it is in the way that I try to approach things with my own children and the way I conduct my life is that you can still look at reasons to have standards, and they're informed by evidence and principle rather than informed by religious authority. Because religious authority gets to decree what is.
I really agree with you. I think that the problem is that when people leave the church, sometimes they haven't had. I think because I grew up in England, I had another part of a life that happened to me, whereas some of the people that grow up here had not experienced some of the things. Because I actually went to. You have two separate lives when you're in England, because you have your church life and you have your life with all your other friends, and you know that they aren't bad people because you're interacting with them all the time, like everybody you go to work with, or you go to school, or if you go to college, or whatever you do, you're acting with all these people, and they are good people. So I never thought that they were bad people. I just had separate lives, and I think that when I see it here, I've seen it where people have gone totally off the rails, and those were things that were happening to people in my society when maybe they were 16 or whatever. And sometimes when I agree with you, I've told my kids about some of the experiences that I've had, but and hopefully they won't have to have some of the things that happened. But the thing is, these people they haven't had any of that, and so everything goes into question, because when you find out about the church, it's such a shock on your system when you find out that the church isn't true, that you haven't, some people haven't got any reference or any framework.
No, that's the thing about
on.
What you're talking about, having life experiences behind that. In America, we kind of have what we call the mission field, and then Utah. And I grew up in Texas, and so I was in the mission field. And like you, most of my interactions were during my normal school day with non-Mormons. But I had this part of my existence that was very frequent every weekend, every Wednesday, every time I went to Scouts or whatever, that was surrounded by my Mormon people. And anytime I had the ability to meet with Mormons during the week in school, we would definitely congregate together. We were the Mormon mob. But the other side of that, where if you've grown up in a very insular church environment and then you go through the process of leaving the church, I think it's very normal, even though it can be fraught with danger, for people to go through that adolescence even later in their life. Normal people outside of the church go through a period of adolescence where they test the boundaries. They try to differentiate themselves from their parents, so they specifically try to rebel against things that their parents may have taught them, just to try to stand on their own 2 feet and make their own way. And, this is where people have their indiscretions in their youth. And it kind of is a time when you go out and you learn about yourself. You make mistakes and you recover them. And hopefully those mistakes that you make aren't terrible, that they severely limit your future. But when you grow up in the church and you've been, particularly people who have been scrupulous about their adherence to Mormon standards, they don't go through any of that process. And so if you leave the church after that,
they've been deprived of it. I almost see it being deprived. But see, there was only ever 3 people in my whole school that were Mormons in England. So
really?
Yes. So basically, when I grew up, and the other 2 didn't say they were Mormons. I was the only one that they ever knew in the school that was a Mormon anyway, because the others didn't want to say what religion or anything that they were. But so people knew that I was Mormon. So I never hung around with the other Mormons at school. I didn't. My life was totally separate. And I didn't really get on very well with the people in my ward. Basically. So most of my friends were all non-members. I didn't have this I hang around with the Mormons at school. I hang around with my friends at school. In fact, they do their thing. I remember I was on the steps and they're all smoking in the toilets. And the teacher comes up and says, "Are you smoking?" I'm like, "No, I'm not smoking. I'm a Mormon." But they were all legging out the back of the toilets.
You were the cover.
They knew I didn't smoke, but I didn't.
That's why they had you at the front door.
Well, I was sitting on the other door, and they were in the toilet, and they were escaping. But I just let them. I told them I didn't like it that they smoked, but I let them do what they wanted to do. So, I did not impose my rules on them, and they respected they didn't impose their rules to make me smoke.
Yeah.
And so they were doing it, and even going to school, they were watching Damien and stuff, and I would just sit on the stairs in the hallway while they were watching Damien in the morning, because I didn't want to participate in that. And I left them to do what they wanted to participate, and I participated in what I wanted to do, but I did see the consequences of lots of their actions. So I think that I got a very different childhood from people around here, because there were lots of things that were happening. Because I went to nightclubs and stuff with them. I participated in all that kind of stuff with them, but I just didn't drink when I went to the nightclubs. But actually, they were much better than the Mormon ones, because the ones that they had in our ward, the lights were on, and you're flipping self-conscious about dancing with the flipping lights on, whereas it was dark, and so I just went.
Well, I do want to touch on what I see as a significant difference there, and for me, a big part of it is in this essay. A lot of the damage and a lot of the rumination that interrupts the young man who's growing up in this context is the fact that these standards are tied to his personal sense of worth. And
Yeah.
having that be the paradigm where you look at your standards and values is that they are what determine your worth. So much so that you regularly go in for interviews where you are interrogated about your worthiness, which is determined by your adherence to these standards. Then it makes any mistake, any time that you've been influenced by your peers, and you do that, really have an impact on your life and your sense of well-being and value and worth that is far more than it should. If you look
I
at
agree
your
with you. I
values
think
in
that
a way,
I totally agree with you, and I think that a lot of the situations that I've had with, I had a bishop, but the bishop got up in church and he said the miracle of forgiveness, but I didn't know that the talk was on the miracle of forgiveness. And my dad came home from church, but see, my wall was also filled with a whole bunch of Christians that had come out and had joined the church. So they were all in their first generation. And my dad came home and he said to us, the bishop has been possessed by Satan, so don't take any notice of what he said in church today. And so, I had a counterbalance to everything that the church was trying to do. I had all these members that were first-time members that were in my ward, and they would do lots of things for you on the whole. Like I had this one bishop that same bishop that gave that talk on miracle forgiveness, that he basically said that it'd be better that we be dead and everything. And there was such a riot in the ward about his stuff that he had to apologize. So the thing is, I had a lot of counterbat and things. I didn't realize that some of this stuff came from the church. We just thought that he'd been possessed. I thought he'd been possessed.
that's because he was just teaching what they had taught in general conference, but they saw that as something that was satanic or possessed.
Yes, they did.
Do you think that your experience having kind of an unconventional Mormon existence made your transition easier once you finally learned about the true nature of the history of the church?
Well, I don't know, because what happened to me was that I was dyslexic, and I also got Perry-Romberg. So my whole face was disfigured, and I had surgery. So I was really spiritually tied to the church, and I had lots of spiritual experiences while I was in the church, and I had to pull myself out of those. I've had spiritual experiences since in fact, I resigned in the end because I wanted to know if I still was going to have those spiritual experiences that I've had. And I would say I've got an even stronger belief in God, and I know all the junk about him, but I still, I know all the stuff that people have said. My husband doesn't believe anymore, but I would say I really like your show, Billy. I really, really do like your show. But I would say that it had my whole self-worth was, to a certain extent, was tied up in the church. So I think because I had so many, basically, because I was dyslexic and I really did really bad, I had a really hard time in school, and then I was disfigured. But the thing was, I did know my friends liked me for who I was, and the school was there. I went to an all-girls school, so the school was really, really good to me. I had a really good experience with my secondary school. My junior school and my infant school weren't, because it's kind of like Harry Potter. It's like all segregated, because we have an infant school, then we have a junior school, then we don't have we didn't call it senior school. I don't know if they do now, but we called it senior. We didn't have high school, but that started at 11. So I had a very different, but I think there's something happens in a society when the girls and the boys are split up, and the girls were quite nice to me, even though whereas when you were in the junior school and stuff, you had, I don't know. So I had a really hard time in my first start. I got really, really emotionally involved with the church, and so it was.
Yeah, I think that's something
I did
that
have another
you'll
life,
find
but
much more
I'd like
commonly.
to go back to England because it drives me crazy sometimes here.
Yeah, is people's sense of worth being tied up in their membership of the church, and to the extent that that's a very deep part of their identity, then it in some cases makes it harder to leave the church, harder to look at things that would impeach the claims of the church, and then once you do it, it almost makes it more painful to do that. So I can understand.
Yes, but you have to look. I mean,
I need to get to the next
call. They tell you to go do your
so,
genealogy, and they tell you to do that, and all of that is, if you're going to do those things good, and I was doing that from the time I was 8. My mum was having me pull the books off. So when I started getting into all of that, I was analysing things. And once you get to the stage where you're analysing things, that teaches you to analyse, and you'll be having to critically think to do things like that. And so I don't. My husband found out. I don't think I would have found out if it hadn't been for my husband. But basically, I found out because they gave me a sheep dip baptism, and I got absolutely furious about it. And then they were mucking about because they don't treat you the same here as they did in England. And I think culturally, I just about got to the breaking point I actually said to my husband, I've had enough. I just want to kill myself because I can't handle this environment anymore, because I knew that it was like I was trying to do everything that I could do. But I got to myself that I said, and then he said to me, before you go kill yourself, you need to know the church isn't true. And then I said to him, and then I started going on to Fair Mormon, and I found out from Fair Mormon that the whole thing wasn't, basically I found out from just looking at Fair Mormon, I thought, this is just bullshit, they're just lying to me. And then I started reading all the others. We read the Australian guy's Sutherland's book.
Yeah, Sutherland's
about
book.
DNA, and I knew that was the truth. And
the irony is that discovering that, in a sense, saved your life if you were at that point where you were contemplating suicide. I just got to that point. So basically, then it didn't really help finding out, because you don't know whether I just got enough. I'd had enough with the people, because the ward that I was living in at the time were really not the people that I live in the ward now. But I don't go to church, but they are nice to me in the area. Well, I have a question for you, though, and that is that a lot of times, particularly when you have a lot of things that affected you deeply and a need to connect with other people and to have that experience validated, connecting with other people that have been through that same transition in the faith can be helpful. Have you had a chance to talk with other people in your area, like go to meetups or anything like that? And
I went to one. I went to a camp, because I've been out for a while now. I really have been out for a while, but no, I've had 3 separate counselors, which have actually worked out. The latest one I had that hasn't helped me. I'm trying to I think I've got basically over a lot of the emotional stuff, but like I had a flipping major thing that happened to me that was really, I got to the stage I got so mad about the whole situation. I prayed about it, and I realized that the whole lot was bullshit. It just clicked on like a ball of light that I got off. I just knew that it was really, really bad. But then I went and I got to the stage where I
allow some other people
out.
to call in tonight. Okay, so I don't want to cut you off, but it sounds like you do have a lot of things that you want to talk about, and so I would just want to recommend that you find some local community of people who are either post-Mormon or in a more open Mormon thing, and connect with them, because I think there's a lot of healing to be found in that. Not only that, but sometimes when these things, particularly if you've ever been at a point where you've contemplated suicide and the church has played any role in that, then seeking out the help of a therapist can be very, very helpful. So I want to thank you for your call, but I have to get on to allow some other people to call in. So
okay, I'm sorry. I go on a bit. All right,
that's all right. No worries. All right, have a great time. Bye now. Okay, so let's see here. Blair Jane. Oh, we got another call. Hello, you're on Talk on Things and Stuff.
Hello. How's it going?
Going all right. What's on your mind?
Well, the Holy Ghost has already went to bed, so yeah.
Yeah, I had family visiting, and I had somebody help me fix some lighting, and I just wanted to test it out a little bit, and I think he's over there bored to death trying to figure out when I'm going to end this thing now. But so it's a little bit unusual time for what I do.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about maybe the masturbation subject here.
Yeah.
So I was on Wikipedia, and they do have the subject, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and masturbation. It's really, somebody did their research on this. So
you're saying if you go to the which Wikipedia page is it?
Oh, are they numbered? I'm not sure.
Is it on masturbation in particular? Or is it on...
So yeah, it's just the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and masturbation. And scrolling down, they have the years all cataloged.
Okay.
And there is one, let's see, I think it's in the 80s.
What was it about it in particular that...
1983, yeah. I'll go ahead and read it here, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Okay. In October, an LDS psychiatrist, Cantrell Nielsen, paid a death malpractice settlement to Eugene Eliasson for prescribing that his patient, 16-year-old Kip Eliasson, abstain from masturbation as directed by his bishop. This allegedly contributed to the patient's shame-induced suicide on 2 March 1982 over his inability to stop masturbating as recorded in his journal. So it's just sad. Real sad. But yeah, I remember going into the interviews and are you keeping the law of chastity? And most of the time I knew what they were talking about, but I just lie about it. And so I don't know what's worse, telling the truth and being prescribed some sort of psychiatrist, or just
you're talking about the story
about
of Kip Eliasson, which was actually probably the most known about incidents of a young man who converted to the church with his family and started listening to the teachings of the church at that time in, I think, the 1970s, where there was a very strong reliance on the miracle of forgiveness, the idea that it's better to be dead clean than alive and unworthy. And those things were in the air, and he struggled as a young teenage boy with masturbation. And he, you know, some people take the church very, very seriously, and other people don't take it that seriously. And it has to do with something called religious scrupulosity, where people who just because of the way that they think and process things, they take it all very, very seriously. And he was one of those people. And since he, as a teenager, full of testosterone, was not able to stop it, he felt so worthless and so hopeless in living up to the standards that he killed himself. And he left a suicide note for his father. And you can actually see, it's actually a very touching story that I created a brief video about for the Protect LDS Children movement that I'll play real quick. It doesn't take long at all. Hold on just a second.
Oh, yeah.
You may not be able to hear it on the phone, but I think we can hear it here.
I'll just replay the video.
Okay.
I couldn't ask for a better brother than Kip.
Gene and Perry Eliasson, father and brother of young Kip, who committed suicide early in 1982 at the age of 16.
Kip was almost a perfect son. He was a 4-point student, Capital High School. He was involved with the track team where he got the most inspirational track team member. Kip was my best friend and partner since his mother passed away when he was 5 years old. The last 2 years, Kip was so busy with his other activities with the church that most of our outside activities came to a halt. The more deeply Kip got involved with the church, the more depressed he became. So I sat down with Kip and would discuss this problem with him and to find out what was bothering him. At that point, he told me that he had feelings, sexual feelings that were in direct conflict with the teachings of the church. When Kip went to the LDS counselors, they only reinforced the teachings of the church, which just increased Kip's feelings of unworthiness.
I know what Kip was going through. I went to the same type interviews that he did. The pressure was great to strive for worthiness, to be perfect all the time. The only problem is Kip took it a little too seriously.
This is all I have left from my son Kip. It was the last letter he left me. Dad, I love you more than words can say. If it were possible, I would stay alive for only you. For I really only love you, but it's not possible. I must first love myself, and I do not. A strange feeling of darkness and self-hate overpowers all my defenses. I must unfortunately yield to it. This turbulent feeling is only for a few to truly understand. I feel that you do not comprehend the immense feeling of self-hatred I have. This is the only way I feel that I can relieve myself of these feelings now. Carry on with your life and be happy. I love you more than words can say. Son Kip.
All right. So that was a video made in the middle of working with Sam Young for the Protect LDS Children movement, where we're trying to encourage the church to update their practices regarding worthiness interviews to eliminate harmful practices and promote protective practices for children. So, it's a good thing that the art, I think his story needs to come up anytime that they mention that, because it's pretty powerful. All right, did you call her?
I agree.
Okay, I have to do my little connection thing again. Hold on. So the audience can probably guess, but I cannot. Are you there now?
Yes, I'm here.
There, I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, so do you feel like Sam Young actually had any effect on the church? Did they change anything, or?
Yeah, I think that the policy changes that we saw, where the church started to make the ability of a parent or other person to be present during the interviews, was a direct result of his activism. And I think that there's still more changes that will probably be forthcoming in that. So I think
so. The fight's still not over. Sam Young is still currently.
So long as we have men who have not received background checks bringing children into their offices who are given carte blanche to ask questions about the children's sexual life, that is tied to the concept of worthiness, that normalizes that type of interaction, that is done in secret and privacy, potentially behind a closed door. Because that's still the default option. It's only if the child requests it that you have a third person there. And even if a third person is there, there's still problems with it. I think so long as that paradigm still exists, there is harm that is continuing to be perpetuated. So,
have you heard of Fight the New Drug?
I have.
I heard tell that they have a website where children are going and talking about their very private sexual lives, and writing it all down for just anybody to read. As young as 13, kids are doing that.
That's something that
I just wonder if Sam Young is approaching that at all as well.
Yeah, I think allowing people who aren't the parents directly responsible and involved to interact with children about their normal sexual development, or not accountable and ethically guided professionals, is fraught with danger. You're never going to completely eliminate abuse that comes from parents or from professionals, but you want to do it in situations where people are accountable and where there are safeguarded practices, where there's a method for reporting. And just the church's current standard is not the gold standard. There's plenty of evidence for that. I think the focus of this particular essay really was just on the internal harm, the self-worth issues that come along with the way that masturbation in particular is demonized. And, it's probably no surprise that this story is really my story, and that nose picking is just a proxy for masturbation. And the feelings of worthlessness, of bargaining with God, all these different things, the feelings of feeling like everybody else is fine and I'm the only one who's broken, those are all just really true lived experiences for me. And as I've talked to other people that have come out, it's absolutely true. Not only that, but talking to people who themselves were bishops and said, yeah, I was disciplining teenagers for masturbating, but I was doing it myself. I just thought that I was imperfect and I still had to teach the right standards. So when all the hypocrisy that goes along with it, the fact that it taught me to lie to my priesthood leaders just so that I wouldn't have the shame and the guilt.
Right.
A lot of that just, it messes with you, with your own moral compass and with your own sense of self-worth. And it's all tied around this one particular issue. So not passing that same aura of guilt and shame onto my own children is a big part of my own personal healing with this. It was, I think, a little bit painful for me later when I finally got the will and the bravery to talk to my mother about these issues. Because I expressed to her how much I felt personal just worthlessness for years, even into my adulthood over this. Her response was, well, I never thought that was a sin. I didn't know they were teaching that to you guys. And as I reflected on it kind of makes sense. She was not there in the priesthood lessons. She didn't go to priesthood session of conference where a lot of these stories and teachings are reinforced. And so she didn't even understand the burden that I was under my whole teenage life. And so that's kind of a big part of the problem with it. And that's why I think talking more about it is helpful. Learning about the story of when it goes wrong is helpful. And I think because of stories like Kip Eliason, we're not seeing as much teaching in the church about masturbation in particular as we have in the past. But these things still have a way of finding their way because you have a leader who was raised the way that they were in the past that then is put in charge of the youth, and he starts to teach those same things in his commentary around the lesson manuals. So it still happens.
I believe the manual, whatever the bishops have, the stake presidents, as far as interviews go, they start asking about masturbation again once the person is 18 and ready to go on a mission. Until that point, they're told not to talk about it so much, just glaze over the law of chastity, but they don't.
To my knowledge,
I think even directly ask, what does that mean? I don't think they'll talk about masturbation, but
I think that's been people's local experience. But there's never been an official policy that is church-wide that you can reference that specifically draws a boundary of what a bishop is not allowed to ask. And this is something that when you look at the Australian Commission on Sexual Abuse in Institutions, they drew up a series of best practices. And when you look at some of the best practices, it includes that when you define policies and procedures for your institution, for adults dealing with vulnerable people, you define what the appropriate interactions are, and you also specifically define what inappropriate boundaries that should not be crossed. So you would then have a list of specifically what bishops are not allowed to interrogate children about, so that if something does happen, then you report it and they can point to that specific thing. And right now, the guidance of the church is that bishops have the mantle of, as judge in Israel, the Spirit can act upon them, and part of their calling is to follow those impulses and impressions. And if that means that they have to ask more and more sexual questions to follow the Spirit as they believe, then they feel empowered to do that. And I've had discussions with my own brother where I've asked the question, is there anything that you could say that a bishop should never be allowed to ask? And he says no, because the bishops need to be able to follow the Spirit. And if it means that they should go there, they should. And so that open-endedness is the problem. There should be guidances for what is too far, what boundary can be crossed. In that way, when it does happen, people know about it. And you also have to teach that to the children. You have to teach them, if anyone, no matter who, the bishop or anyone else, starts talking about these things, that is a red flag, and you need to go find another person to tell. Those are all included in the Australian Commission's guidances for institutions, specifically religions, on how to do that. So.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting is they never ask me how much service have you done, you know, or and what do you feel when you give service or anything like that. It's more that doesn't apply to your worthiness. It's oh, did you touch yourself there? You know, it's like maybe, you know, and it's interesting how children. As I was a child, I would just try to make deals with God, right? My own personal covenants, and I go into this like paracosm of different almost religion in order to stay in another religion, a little dissociation from the primary religion into my secondary, just to feel worthy, I suppose. I don't know.
Well, I mean,
but
that bargaining thing, it happens when you talk to people. They're like, yeah, I would say, you know, I'll do this, God, if you give me the strength to resist. And then I would just fail. And so your own internal, you know, covenants with God that you're making to try to overcome that add to your sense of failure. Because, like, this is just between you and God, and you can't even solve that. Anyway.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I better wrap things up. I appreciate your call, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
Hey, thanks, John.
All right. Take care. All right. Well, it is getting late, and I should wrap things up. So until there's a few other episodes on this particular subject that I want to cover. Next time, we will learn about the gap of Onan and what that means. So look forward to that. Anyway, if you Google it, you'll see a little bit of a preview on it. So until next time, this is Talk on Things and Stuff.